over there?
I'm doing great.
Let's see if it works. Look at him go.
One of those pucks on a air table. All right. It's time for you to go.
Just send him on his way. No, he was destroyed. That's what happens when you fly out an airlock in space. What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and today I have something a little bit different for you. This is going to be a Warhammer 40k battle report that we filmed on Tabletop Simulator. Now, I'm still super new to Tabletop Simulator, so I'm still getting the hang of it, but I'm sure we'll figure it out and make something super cool. So, for this game, I took a Tyranids list that I have never played before, and I'm shaking a bit of the rust off the Tyranids because I haven't played them in months. I've been focusing on my Grey Knights recently, but I kind of got the bug in me again, so I'm going to give them another shot. So for this game, I was playing a whole brigade of bugs, or a bugade, if you will. This one 100% High Fleet Chronos, and I really wanted to lean really heavily into bringing a lot of guns to the table. I've seen a lot of success with those lists recently, and I wanted to see how far I can push it, and we'll see how that goes in this game. So the list has 2 Broodlords and a Neurothrope fulfilling out the HQ choices. The Neurothrope's going to have the Resonance Barb in order to cast Symbiostorm a little more easily, and then obviously we have to have 6 troop choices in there, so I have a unit of 21 Termagants. They're mainly so I can double move them and run out and grab a ton of objectives really easily. I have 4 Ripper Swarms, just 3 Ripper Swarms each to fill out those troops really cheaply, as well as a unit of 20 Gene Stealers. Now, a big issue with the Tyranid guns is that it doesn't engage in melee very well, so I figured bringing 2 Broodlords and 20 Gene Stealers would be able to clear off a lot of jamming models and units that come in to engage the guns. For the other choices, we have 2 full units of 6 Hive Guard with Impaler Cannons, as well as a unit of Venom Thropes. The Venom Thropes are pretty key in a gun line battle, since that -1 to hit with their 3 models that they have gives out such a huge aura, and the whole list is going to be concentrated in a little area because it's a big old gun line. We also have 3 units of 10 Gargoyles to fill out fast attack. I actually love these guys. They can deep strike for free. They're just 10 models you can jump into screen. They have fly of 12-inch moves, so they can run out, grab objectives really easily, and you can just drop them anywhere you want. Alongside the Rippers, that gives you a ton of board presence that you can drop in turn 2 to grab secondary objectives really easily. And then for heavy support, I went all in on Exocrines. We're taking 3 Exocrines today. I don't really like Exocrines. I don't really see the damage output that they bring for the cost. And because you can only strat one of them to count as stationary, I think bringing more than one usually ends up not working out too well. But I'm going to bring 3 today because we're going really heavily into the guns, and we'll see how it works. My opponent for this game was playing a super cool list, a pure Chaos Demons list. No Chaos Space Marines, no Thousand Suns here. And not only that, pure Nurgle Demons. And featuring even a great unclean one. A bunch of stuff that you haven't seen on competitive tables for a long time, and they might be making a comeback. So the demon list for this game was bringing 2 battalions, so bringing in that 13 CP. It had a bunch of the character HQs in there, including Horticulus Slimex, Epidemius, as well as a great unclean one with a Doomsday Bell and a Poxbringer. For the troops, obviously, it was 6 units of 3 Nurglings to add some tough objectives secured and a lot of board presence with that forward deployment. And then, for the mainstay of the list, we have 3 units of 9 Beasts of Nurgle, as well as a unit of 7 Plague Drones. This puts 178 toughness 5 wounds on the table, all of which can be brought back by the Great Unclean One. Now, my opponent did make a slight mistake in list building and didn't leave room for a Feculent Gnarlmaw for Horticulus Slimex to summon in. So, unfortunately, his Beasts of Nurgle won't be advancing and charging, but that is an enormous amount of board presence to throw down on the board, march right up the table, and grab a ton of objectives. It's all incredibly difficult to kill, it all regenerates wounds, and because it has so many wounds, it can be affected by healing effects like the Nurgle Psychic Power to heal D3 wounds, or Horticulus Slimex's ability to regenerate a wound every turn. All the while, the entire list is made up of Nurgle demons, so anything it kills will be added to Epidemius' tally, buffing the entire army with reroll 1s to hit, rerolls to wound, potentially +1 toughness, which brings the entire army to toughness 6, You get wounded on 5s by heavy bolters and stuff like that. Even the Great Unclean One gets up to toughness 8, which is enormous, and it's not too hard because if you're playing into a horde list, these Beasts of Nurgle can put out so many attacks, all of which adds to Epidemius's count. Overall, this is a super cool combo list that's relying very heavily on that Great Unclean One to survive and get up the table. If it can, and it can limit line of sight to the Beasts of Nurgle so that they end up being tough to wipe out, they could regenerate an enormous number of wounds, get a little bit of extra distance by placing in front of their unit, and just slam through their opponent's army. So the mission we were playing for this game was mission number 1 out of the ITC packet. That is Seize Ground, so it places 6 objectives on the battlefield, and the bonus point is to hold any 4. Obviously, we're just playing standard ITC rules, so you get a point if you hold an objective, get a point if you kill a unit, and you get a point at the end of the round if you hold more objectives than your opponent, and if you kill more units than your opponent does. My opponent won the roll to go first and actually chose to go second, so he was able to re-roll his dice for the deployment zone and rolled into Dawn of War. Because he's such a fast, aggressive melee list, he decided to stick with Dawn of War, and I deployed my army first. So with my list being such a heavy guideline, I decided to deploy everything in a little castle on my left-hand flank. I figured that my opponent's list was going to be so massive and wide that I wasn't going to have trouble finding avenues of line of sight. I decided to put the Exocrines near the center of the table so they could get good lines of sight around the 2 L's in the middle, and I put 1 unit of Hive Guard on each side since obviously they don't have to worry about line of sight, so I can have one to target any units that are hiding behind either of those L's. In the back of the formation, I put the Gene Stealers and the Broodlords. I decided not to keep those guys too far forward in case they got engaged and taken out early, and then I could get attacked by my opponent's fast movers and I wouldn't have any punchback. I put the unit of 21 Termagants right up in the front there. The plan is to double move those guys with Metabolic Overdrive really early, run out, grab a ton of objectives, hopefully score the bonus point on turn 1, and screen out my opponent since he has a lot of beasts in his army that can't move through those big ruin L walls, and also won't be able to move through the Termagants either. Hopefully that'll buy me a turn so that the Exocrines and the Hive Guard can deal enough damage that my Gene Stealers and Broodlords could close things out. So my opponent began deployment, and we quickly realized that his army was physically too large for the Dawn of War space to adequately fit it. Not that he couldn't fit all his models in, but it was tough to chain them back to the Great Unclean One and also have them in relevant positions on the board. For that reason, my opponent decided to deep strike one of his units, so he spent 2 CP, and he decided to make that his unit of Plague Drones. Now, in hindsight, it probably would have been better to make it one of the 3 Beasts of Nurgle units. Those units are larger, and the Plague Drones fly and have a pretty fast movement speed, so being able to deep strike them isn't quite as important. The downside is that they are a lot easier to kill, since each of them are 4 wounds instead of 5. My opponent was worried that I'd be able to target them down and pick them off immediately on turn 1, but because of their speed, I think he could have deployed them in a defensive position where I wasn't going to be able to safely get guns on target on them. Because the Plague Drones are deep striking in, I'm not as worried about their speed, and overall I think he does lose a little bit of efficacy. So with that, we shake hands and the first round begins. So I started off the first round by running my unit of 21 Termagants up the table. They rolled a 2 for their run, which wasn't enough to get them up to the center objectives, so I ended up spending the CP on Metabolic Overdrive, running up and capturing the 2 objectives in my deployment zone, as well as the 2 objectives in the center of the board to secure myself the bonus point on turn 1. The rest of my formation essentially stood still. Unfortunately, I failed my Symbiostorm, so I wasn't going to be able to get the benefit from that this turn. Because of my opponent's positioning, all 3 of my Exocrines were in range and line of sight, so I didn't have to move and I didn't have to strat them to count them as stationary, and I decided to just start hammering into the Beasts of Nurgle with all of my big guns. At the start of my shooting phase, my opponent decided to Warp Surge a unit of beasts that both of my Hive Guard units were in range in, including the blue unit on the far left. I decided to shoot the blue Hive Guard unit into the Warp Surge unit of Beasts of Nurgle just to start taking some out, but in hindsight, I think this was actually a big mistake. Because they were Warp Surged, I ended up only killing 1 or 2, and those guys were going to potentially be regenerated by the Great Unclean One. What I needed to do was hammer into a single unit, which the blue Hive Guard were out of range of. But because the Beasts of Nurgle are so difficult to kill, I wasn't guaranteed a kill on this turn. In fact, it was pretty unlikely. In hindsight, what I should have done is focus fire down the 2 Nurgling squads on that side of the table so that my opponent would have to commit his more expensive melee units to holding down that leftmost objective. The Nurgling units are easy to kill, would have guaranteed me a kill on the first turn, and since I was throwing away my Termagants, I know my opponent is going to probably get 1 kill this turn. So, in reality, I'm giving up 2 points between the kill point and kill more for my opponent destroying the Termagants. I was still able to do an immense amount of damage to the central Beasts of Nurgle unit. Between the 3 Exocrines and a double fire from the red Hiveguard unit, I was able to kill 5 of them, bringing them down to less than half of their starting number.
But I will hold and bonus.
I mean, you gangbustered.
I did gangbuster a bunch. Yeah,
Did you just finish it? Or is it, it's for 6?
15,
So it's 5?
20, 25, 30.
30.
Did I? Yeah.
So it's,
Is that right? All right. 1, 2, 3.
yeah, it's 5 points of gangbuster.
That was easy.
You're scoring that one out instantly against this horse.
My opponent's first turn was pretty uneventful and basically went exactly how you would expect. He ran forward all of his units. The green Beasts of Nurgle unit in the center moved up right next to the Termagants that I'd thrown up in there, and everything charged into them. My opponent was able to get a couple psychic powers off, but has absolutely no guns in the list besides the strange Death's Head weapons on the Plague Drones, so his turns went pretty quickly. He was able to make a couple good charges into the Termagants, even getting the Great Unclean One into them with a pretty long charge roll, easily wiping that unit out and scoring a kill, hold, and bonus point on the first turn thanks to some Nurglings on the far right-hand flank. So my second round began, and I was getting a little worried about how close those Beasts of Nurgle were getting because of that long charge as well as the consolidate. Fortunately, without a Feculent Narwhal, they aren't actually that fast. They are only speed 6, but they're so resilient that it doesn't really matter because they're going to press me into that corner pretty hardcore anyway. Because they are beasts, they can't actually move through ruin walls, so I felt a little safer moving up on that left-hand flank, which I felt was pretty weak. I sent my Venom Thropes up in there because their ability to stop shooting is not very useful in this matchup, and I figured that they would be better served fighting some Nurglings for a while. I ended up moving my Exocrines back just to force my opponent to advance for another turn to try to get into them, and slightly repositioned the rest of my formation. It was time for some of my Deep Strikers to come in. I left 2 Ripper units in reserve, and I brought in all my Gargoyles as well as 2 of my Ripper Swarms. 1 went in each corner in the back of my opponent's deployment zone, and all 3 Gargoyle units went into my opponent's deployment zone in order to score recon as well as behind enemy lines. Because I had 3 units in my opponent's deployment zone on turn 2, I was going to score 2 points for behind enemy lines thanks to all the Gargoyle units. I also deployed them on the left flank so that they could take some shots at the Nurglings and hopefully whittle them down a little bit. I was able to horror the central unit of Beasts of Nurgle and hammer into them with all 3 Exocrines, spending the CP to count 1 as stationary, but because they were the obvious target, my opponent elected to Warp Surge them, and the Exocrines didn't do as much damage as I'd hoped. I only ended up killing 2 Beasts of Nurgle out of that central green unit, but my Hive Guard were both in range of the red unit that I had killed 5 members of on the previous turn. Between both units of Hive Guard shooting, as well as a double shoot and Symbiostorm from my Neurothrope, I was able to wipe that unit out, putting me up on the scoreboard for a kill and maxing out my Gangbuster secondary. I put a couple wounds into the Nurglings with the Gargoyles shooting, but it wasn't quite as effective as I'd hoped. I haven't really played the Gargoyles before yet. I do like them as deep strikers, but their large bases make it difficult to get a lot of shots off when they deep strike in. Fortunately, I was able to make a couple charges and get the Venom Thropes into one of the Nurgling units, as well as make a charge with one of the Gargoyle units to go in and wrap another Nurgling unit. Not that that really mattered because my opponent didn't actually have any guns, but it would force him to take attacks from me on the subsequent turn. I was able to kill 1 Nurgling out of each unit and actually proc the Gargoyle's blinding venom abilities so that they didn't take any damage from those Nurglings in response.
I'm going to do what's called a pro gamer move.
So I have a special rule on these guys that I've never read. If you suffer any unsaved wounds in melee from me, you get -1.
What is this for?
You take a mortal wound on this unit because they're within an
shit.
inch of Venom Thropes. Get got, dude. We killed a base with the miasma. Super tech play. That put me up a kill and a hold on turn 2, but because my opponent was being so aggressive, I probably wasn't going to be able to score any hold more, and because I put so much chaff in my opponent's deployment zone, it was pretty likely he was going to get kill more next turn as well. So my opponent responded to all my Deep Strikers by actually changing tack. He turned the green unit of Beasts of Nurgle in the center of the table around and moved them to the back corner of his deployment zone to deal with all of my chaff back there. This took a lot of forward pressure from me, but promised my opponent that he would score some easy kills on subsequent turns. He kept his last unit of Beasts of Nurgle back on his back rightmost objective to hold that down, as well as potentially string it forward to other objectives on future turns. Those guys were essentially going to end up as glorified engineers, just sitting in the back and scoring a bunch of objectives. There's nothing really I can do about them. They're so resilient that even pecking at them with the Hive Guard is only going to kill 1 or 2, and they're just going to be regenerated by the Great Unclean One, so focusing on them at all is pretty pointless for me. Because it is turn 2, my opponent brought in his Deep Strikers. His Blight Drones dropped into the ruin on the right-hand flank, so as to be out of line of sight since their profile is pretty susceptible to exocrine shooting, and dropping them into a more dangerous position could have been a big mistake. In hindsight, what I should have done is place a unit of Rippers in front of my Hive Guard to further screen back where those Blight Drones could go. That would have removed entirely the possibility of a long bomb charge on those Hive Guard, and put a useful unit in that area to screen off the Plague Drones next turn. Fortunately, because of all my Deep Strikers in the back, I was able to continue using the Deepest Shadow stratagem to muck up my opponent's -1 to hit psychic power, so I didn't have to deal with that since it does affect Symbiote Storm pretty negatively. In the charge phase, unsurprisingly, my opponent charged in the Beasts of Nurgle into my Venom Thropes as well as my Gargoyle units, leaving 1 Gargoyle alive after his attacks and my morale, but wiping out all of my Venom Thropes in order to score a kill. Because I'd only destroyed 1 unit on my turn, that tied us at kill more, my opponent holding more and gaining the bonus for a second turn in a row. Back on my turn, I continued to collapse my castle away from my opponent's models. I moved my Gargoyles down the left-hand side of the board away from the Beasts of Nurgle unit. That one surviving Gargoyle fell back out of combat, and my Hive Guard in the building on my right-hand flank moved backwards alongside my Exocrine to get farther away from the Plague Drones and make that charge a little bit harder. I also dropped my 2 remaining Ripper Swarms on my right-hand flank to secure me recon on that side, since my Hive Guard were moving away and would no longer be able to get that corner for me. I was able to get 1 in my deployment zone in my bottom corner, and I put 1 in the center to secure that in case my bottom corner Ripper Swarm got taken out. I was able to start blasting into the green Beasts of Nurgle unit on the left-hand flank with all 3 Exocrines, using the stratagem to count the red Exocrine that I had moved as stationary. My Hive Guard, because they had moved, and unfortunately I didn't have Onslaught in this list because I only had 3 psychic powers, decided to fire into the Plague Drones and ended up killing 1 of them. But in hindsight, this might have been a mistake because it gives the Great Unclean One the opportunity to respawn it potentially farther forward, giving them a little bit of a threat extension. I hammered into the green Beasts of Nurgle squad with the Exocrines and was able to kill a couple, but Warp Surge really stuffed me up there. And the blue Hive Guard squad fired into the Nurglings to secure me a kill for this turn. The final Nurgling was actually taken out by the last of my green Gargoyle squad, who had just fallen back out of combat, but because of the fly weak keyword could still shoot, and was able to plink the last wound off of a Nurgling base to get me the kill.
I failed my 5, and then I failed my 5.
Go get him, Gargoyle. Worth every one of your 50 points.
Overall, a fairly uneventful turn, but I was happy that I was able to keep the Beasts of Nurgle at bay, although the Plague Drone charge next turn could potentially be devastating. That brought us to the bottom of turn 3, and things progressed as you would expect. The Plague Drones in the center buzzed over the wall and got right up close to the Hive Guard with an extra model brought back by the Great Unclean One. The beasts in the top left-hand corner moved after the Rippers that I had left there, and the beasts in the top right were able to spread out to start grabbing objectives. Epidemius and my opponent's characters also moved after my flankers. Epidemius moved to my Ripper Swarm in the top right-hand side, and Horticulus Slimix began moving towards the left. The Great Unclean One also left his building and started moving towards the left-hand flank to get in on the action as well. My opponent started his charge phase by trying to soak the Hive Guard's Overwatch onto his Nurglings, but that ended up not going so well for him, and he ended up taking a couple wounds for his trouble. Another unit of Nurglings were able to trap my Rippers in the corner and begin the world's greatest trash fight.
First charge is this trash battle back here. The ultimate trash fight.
I mean, this is not trash anymore. This is a real unit fighting.
No, I mean over here.
Oh,
the 3
where you
Nurglings versus the 3 Rippers.
Come the at me. I will rip you. Prepare to be ripped.
You're pinned in the corner.
No, I'm trapped.
I got you against the ropes.
And unfortunately for me, the Plague Drones were able to make their charge against the Hive Guard with a solid roll, moving up or all the way around the ruin to get models on both sides of the Hive Guard and be able to consolidate in and engage one of my exocrines as well. With some excellent rolling for my opponent, unfortunately, my Hive Guard were taken out by the Plague Drones even through their Catalyst. So admittedly, that's another mistake on my part, because if I had deep struck those Rippers in last turn, I could have potentially blocked off the landing zone of the Blight Drones when they moved in on the subsequent turn so that they couldn't place close enough to get to the Hive Guard. They could potentially have just charged the Rippers and wrapped them or done something similar, but that leaves my Hive Guard alive to keep shooting on subsequent rounds. Back on my turn, I advanced both of my Gargoyle units away from the green Beasts of Nurgle on that side of the table. Being in a position where I could max out my behind enemy lines, I decided to run them away as fast as they could. There's nothing else on the table there that they could reasonably damage, and they've already done their job, so I was hoping that I could keep them for later in the game where they could go grab objectives. Being such high model count units, they could run in and outnumber the Beasts of Nurgle or characters. I elected to keep my engaged exocrine in melee. I'm not sure about this decision, but I think it was the right one. Obviously, it can't shoot if it falls back, even if you use the stratagem to counter to stationary, and it would prevent the Blight Drones from getting any overwatch. They do have 2-shot guns that they could use on potentially the Genestealers or one of my Broodlords that goes in, and I could take some unnecessary damage from that. Plus, I was pretty confident that my counterpunch units could wipe out the Plague Drones, or at least make it so that they weren't going to be a threat next turn. So this exocrine not shooting for one round wasn't going to be a big deal. I moved my blue exocrine sideways to get line of sight to both the Beasts of Nurgle and the Great Unclean One, so I could pick my targets wherever I wanted, and obviously all the Broodlords and the Genestealers collapsed in onto the Plague Drones to try to take them out. I ended up casting the Horror on the Plague Drones to give them -1 to hit in case they got a swing back in my fight phase, and tried for a couple smites on them as well, but most of those got denied. My opponent warp surged again onto the green Beasts of Nurgle unit, but I still dumped almost all of my firepower in them between both exocrines and the Hive Guard unit, and ended up doing a ton of damage, killing 4 of the Beasts of Nurgle. Finally, I charged in. Both Broodlords successfully got into melee, as well as all the Genestealers. I'm not sure I positioned my charging units quite right, and I made it easy to pull casualties to stop one of the Genestealers from attacking, but I'm not sure that there was a way around this, since the Plague Drones are such enormous models that pulling even one of them can potentially put a model out of range to pile in and fight. I ended up fighting with my Genestealers first to stop my opponent from being able to interrupt and put a bunch of attacks into them. Even with Horror, the Plague Drones do have a ton of attacks apiece, and I was worried that they would be able to get through the tough 4 Genestealers pretty easily. They do have a lot of multi-damage weapons, so I decided not to cast Catalyst on them, which I normally would have, because most of their attacks are going to be 2 damage and punch right through Catalyst regardless. The Genestealers ended up doing a lot of work. Despite the toughness 5 on the Plague Drones, I do have Scything Talons to reroll 1s to hit, and then I'm just wounding on 5s, and they ended up killing 2 or 3. My opponent intelligently pulled casualties so that the red Broodlord wouldn't be able to swing, but the blue Broodlord was able to go into the building and attack, and he ended up killing another 1 or 2 Plague Drones as well. The swing back was pretty devastating, and my opponent put as many attacks into the Exocrine and the blue Broodlord as he could. The Broodlord went down pretty easily, but the Exocrine ended up passing all of his saves, because the one downside of those Plague Drones is that they don't have any AP on their weapons. At the end of the phase, there were a couple Plague Drones left, so I ended up fighting twice with my Genestealers in order to take them out. But I was running low on CP, so the fight twice ended up bringing me down to 1. That was enough damage to force the remaining 1 or 2 Plague Drones to run away. So at the end of the day, my counterpunch did its job and was able to clear off the units engaging my Exocrine. Back at my opponent's turn, things were pretty uneventful. Fortunately, I'd been able to destroy enough units to create a pretty wide distance between my opponent's army and my own to keep them at bay so I could continue shooting. Unfortunately, that meant that my opponent had a pretty dominating board position and was quickly running up the score between hold more and the bonus point that he was getting every turn. Because his units were so resilient, I wasn't able to quite get enough kills every turn to win out on kill more, because my opponent was able to kill off my chaff units Like, obviously, my Hive Guard got taken out, as well as my Ripper Swarms. So, fortunately for this turn, my opponent ends up moving around. Epidemius moved over to try to charge the blue Rippers on the right-hand corner. Unfortunately for Epidemius, he ended up failing his charge. However, the Nurglings in the bottom right-hand corner fighting Grim Rippers were able to do a lot better and take that unit out. The Beasts of Nurgle on the right-hand flank that were holding multiple objectives and stringing out were doing a great job of just holding down the fort for my opponent, and ended up making a charge on my black unit of Rippers on that right-hand side as well, giving my opponent a pretty dominating lead in kills this turn. At the top of round 5, that put my opponent in a very dominating lead, 20-27. I had been able to max out all of my secondaries, but the domination on primaries was a big concern for me. At this point, I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to claw back on the primary mission, but if I was able to be super aggressive, grab a couple bonus points, and have some 5-point turns, I could potentially turn it around. With that in mind, I made a very aggressive play to grab the bonus point, sending my blue gargoyles to the top left-hand objective. My red gargoyles, unfortunately, I had to spend my last CP to metabolic overdrive them onto objective 3 in the center because they rolled poorly on their advance roll. And my Gene Stealers ran up into the center of the table in order to try to get a charge on my opponent's Poxbringer. If the Gene Stealers were able to do that, I could have strung a Gene Stealer out to the objective on the left-hand side. That would have given me a potential bonus point because the Gene Stealers are OBSEC and the Beasts of Nurgle are not. As a backup plan, I also had my Broodlord on the right-hand side, who was in range to try to charge the Nurgling squads. Unfortunately, in my shooting phase, I did make a mistake, and I dumped a lot of shots into the Beasts of Nurgle, taking them down to one model. The Great Unclean One and Horticula Slimex had healed them quite a bit last turn, and that unit on the left-hand side was sticking around a lot longer than I was comfortable with. What I should have done is planted an Exocrine double tapping into one of the Nurgling units on the right-hand side. That would have wiped it out and hopefully given the Broodlord a pretty solid chance of killing the last one. Unfortunately, I ended up splitting my shots between the two Nurgling units and leaving both alive and denying myself the optimal charge by allowing my opponent to remove as many models as possible. The Broodlord ended up failing his charge anyway, so that didn't matter. And, unfortunately for me, the Gene Stealers also failed a 6-inch charge onto the Poxbringer. So unfortunately, despite my best efforts, I ended up failing to get the bonus point. I had even failed so spectacularly that I didn't actually kill anything. However, the last Nurgling in one of the Nurgling units on the right-hand side ran away because 2 of his friends had died, so I was able to get 1 kill on the scoreboard.
They're leadership 7, so yeah, the
Yeah, we could run away on a 6.
Yep. Let's see.
Yeah! We
Yep,
gotta
on the board.
kill that turn.
My opponent's 5th turn was incredibly straightforward. He was able to charge in and kill the gargoyles that I'd sent in on the top left-hand flank. Epidemius charged my Rippers on the right-hand flank and killed a couple of them. And the last Rippers that I had placed on the right-hand side ended up going down to the Beasts of Nurgle. Unfortunately for me, my opponent's dominating board presence continued to score him hold more and the bonus point, so I was looking even worse after my unfortunate round 5. We continued to play out the last round of the game, even though it was mostly a foregone conclusion in my opponent's favor at this point. I was able to run gargoyles over to the right-hand flank and outnumber my opponent on that central objective there. My Gene Stealers moved up and charged the Great Unclean One. Unfortunately, I had failed to deny his -1 to hit psychic power, and he had a Warlord trait to give him an additional -1 as long as you're within 7 inches, meaning that the Gene Stealers would be -2 to hit. We decided to see how much damage 1,000 points of my army could do to this Great Unclean One, so I ended up firing the Hive Guard and 3 Exocrines into him after the Neurothrope smited the Poxbringer to death. Unfortunately for me, all of that damage and the -2 to hit on the Gene Stealers left that Great Unclean One on just 2 wounds after everything shot into him. Epidemius' buff of +1 toughness was insane here. Obviously, it makes the Exocrine significantly worse at wounding now that they need 5s instead of just 4s, as well as the Gene Stealers, who now only wound on 6s. Fortunately, the Gene Stealers were still able to wrap the Great Unclean One in melee to lock him in and get another round of attacking next turn into him. And because they were objective secured and my opponent only had characters on that objective, we're able to grab objective number 2 and chain back to hold objective number 3 as well. That left me with 4 objectives, so I was able to grab the bonus point this round in an effort to claw back the score a little bit closer to parity. Unfortunately for me, my red Broodlord charged into the Nurglings on my opponent's right-hand flank, and my opponent made an insane number of 5+ invulnerable saves, and he actually failed to wipe the unit out, leaving an entire base alive. The wiggly pool noodle of Beasts of Nurgle. Just like wave around the table. Woo! With my opponent's Great Unclean One locked in combat and most of the rest of the table all too spread out to reliably make charges, my opponent's last turn was pretty fast. Slimex charged into the Gene Stealers. The remaining unit of Beasts of Nurgle were able to move up and charge into my red gargoyles in the center. My opponent's Nurglings moved back to hold objective 4, and we set out to see how much damage he could do to my Gene Stealers. Unfortunately, Slimex plus the Great Unclean One, since the Great Unclean One was on such low hit points, weren't able to kill many Gene Stealers, only killing 5 or so. I lost a couple more to morale, but on the other side of the table, the Beasts of Nurgle were able to get 4 models into melee, killing 9 gargoyles, and because my Red Broodlord was my Warlord and had the Warlord trait of plus 6 inches of synapse, was able to keep that unit alive through morale. Epidemius was able to kill the last Ripper on the top right-hand side so that my opponent still scored a kill, and the Gene Stealers set about attacking the Great Unclean One. Unfortunately, my opponent had been able to heal 4 wounds last turn between Horticulus Slimex's ability and the Unclean One healing himself for D3 with the Psychic Power. That meant that the Gene Stealers needing 6s to wound just barely failed, leaving him on 1 wound and surviving the game. That last round was very solid for me. I was able to hold more and kill more over the course of the turn. As well as scoring the bonus, that gave me a 5-point turn to my opponent's only 2, and brought the score much closer to parity. Unfortunately, because of my opponent's dominance on the primary objective all game, that meant that the final score was 27 for the Tyranids to 33 for the Chaos Demons. Obviously, 27 to 33, still a very close game and an extremely high scoring game. We were both able to get most of our secondaries. My opponent was able to get his Gangbuster for destroying my Hive Guard, as well as my Venom Thropes, and clearly Gangbusters is easy to score against his army. All of the Gargoyles and Rippers jumping in got me a ton of points on recon and behind enemy lines very quickly. But unfortunately, this game sort of showed the downside of playing these Tyranid shooting lists. Unlike a Space Marine army, Tyranid shooting isn't quite good enough to deal the rapid damage that you need to be able to take the center of the board later on. I think my list probably needs some tweaking, potentially more Gene Stealers and some faster threats to take the middle of the board. But in this particular matchup, my opponent's list is so lethal to Tyranid infantry that I don't really have an option to move forward. I definitely made some mistakes. Having Rippers on the right-hand side of the board earlier on would have been super helpful. There were some turns where I absolutely should have targeted Nurglings earlier in order to score kills and potentially kill more, especially the first turn where I gave up 2 points very easily by not just killing a Nurgling unit with a unit of Hive Guard. Some of that is shaking rust off my Tyranids since I haven't played them in a while, and I'm still learning out the Tabletop Simulator system as well. My opponent and I both made some pretty basic mistakes playing with Tabletop Simulator. It's a lot different experience from playing on an actual tabletop. Distances are a lot harder to eyeball, and basic movement, especially in combat, gets fudged a lot. Still, it is nice to be able to test out matchups and still play 40k during this quarantine. So, I hope you guys enjoyed this battle report, and I'd love to hear what you think about the format in the comments down below. I'm definitely going to be playing a lot more Tabletop Simulator over the next couple weeks, so if you guys enjoyed this format and have any comments for me, please let me know, and I'll do my best to make the format better for future videos. I also definitely made a lot of mistakes with my Tyranid play this game, and I would love to hear what you think about my game plan and how the game turned out. It was a close enough game that I think some better play on my end could have overcome the bad matchup and put me in the lead. That said, my opponent also did make a couple mistakes. Like I talked about earlier, I think deep striking the Plague Drones instead of a unit of Beasts of Nurgle was probably a mistake, but overall my opponent's list is very cool, and I'm super excited to see such an awesome paradigm on the table and doing well. With the new ITC 2020 packet, these aggressive lists with high resilience that can take the center of the board are super powerful, and I think the game's going to become a lot more aggressive and dynamic, and that's going to make it much more interesting to play. So thanks for watching, everybody. Remember again to like and comment, subscribe if you want to, and check out Tactical Tours on Patreon, where we got some exclusive videos coming out, and you get early access to videos. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming. Oh my god! Goodbye.
No, come back.
Oh, he's been destroyed. Get f***ed. Alright, well, you know what? This calls for.